Hello, everyone. I know, depending on where you are in the world, it's either very late or very early for some of you. Thank you so much for staying to the end of RustConf. I'm Nell Shamrell-Harrington. I'm a principal engineer at Microsoft and also a board member of the Rust Foundation. I am the lead editor of This Week in Rust, and if you'd like to get in touch with me, the best way to do that is through my Twitter handle at Nell Shamrell. Some of you who attended RustConf last year might recognize me from being the Master of Ceremonies for RustConf 2020. As you might remember, my three pet bunnies, Noah, Lucy, and Leia, all made appearances. They are all well and send their regards to the entire Rustation community. I found Rust through working on the Habitat project at Chef. When I learned Rust, This Week in Rust was a major help and a major inspiration. It was a gateway to the Rust community, a community where empathy and personal maturity are as important as, if not more important than, technical excellence. This Week in Rust, also known as TWIR, is a weekly newsletter that highlights all that is going on in the Rust community. Who watching this subscribes to This Week in Rust? If you do, please put a +1 in the Discord chat right now. All right, who watching has contributed to This Week in Rust? If you have, please put a +1 in that Discord chat. Well, even though I'm pre-recording this, I have no doubt a huge number of +1s just scrolled by. This highlights that This Week in Rust is not just one person's project. I may be lead editor, but I am certainly not the only editor. The current editors are myself, Andre Bogus, and Colton Donnelly. We spend a lot of time and energy making sure that This Week in Rust lands in your inbox every single week. But this newsletter is not only the editor's project. Every week, we receive pull requests adding content, or people tweet at us at This Week in Rust suggesting content. This Week in Rust is a community project. It's created for and by the outstanding Rustation community. This means This Week in Rust is your project. No matter how long you've been interested in Rust, no matter what your level, no matter who you are, your contributions are welcomed and valued. It's your newsletter. It's our newsletter. And its success is because of every one of us. To understand how that success came about, let's start with a look at the history of the newsletter. And like many things in the Rust ecosystem, it started with a conversation on GitHub. Brian Anderson, an early Rust contributor, knew that there was lots of interesting activity happening on the project, but it was too much for most people to keep up with. Ember Arlinks, Brian's intern at the time, took the project and published issue number 1 on June 7th, 2013. This was around the time of Rust 0.7. Can everyone watching this, everyone in the Discord conference chat, please give 3 cheers for Ember right now? As I prepared this talk, I really enjoyed going back through old issues of This Week in Rust. Some highlights include how the older issues would go through each change to the language in words, something that was so helpful in its early days, but would be impossible today. Earlier issues also included lists of new contributors. I particularly like this quote from issue 22. At 0.85 new contributors a day, we'll soon dwarf every other language in the awesome volunteer category. Well, I don't know about you, but I think this prediction definitely came true. Rust is the leader in the awesome volunteer category. If you agree, go ahead and put a +1 in the conference chat right now. Something I also love about the early issues is that they could list all the known uses of Rust in production, something we probably wouldn't be able to do today. I'd like to give a shout out to Tilde and OpenDNS, 2 of Rust's early adopters. Additionally, This Week in Rust used to feature sections about specific projects. including This Week in Servo, which was contributed by Lars Bergstrom. Servo was another of the very early projects written in Rust. Also, This Week in Rust used to feature This Week in Cargo, the Rust dependency manager we all know and love. I learned something interesting when I looked back at the issue where Cargo was introduced. If you've ever wondered why Cargo's website URL is crates.io, it's because a startup was already using cargo.io at that time. Now you know. From its early days, This Week in Rust showed the heartbeat of the growing Rust community, something I believe it still does today. Reddit user Programmer put it this way: This Week in Rust plays a very important role in the Rust community as an aggregator of community updates. I became lead editor of This Week in Rust in early 2020. However, Vikrant Chaudhary, also known as NASA42, was lead editor for most of the newsletter's life. Brian Anderson, another early editor of the newsletter, puts it this way: there were a number of times in Rust history where a volunteer stepped up out of nowhere and just carried a whole subsystem. NASA42 taking over This Week in Rust was one of those. Can everyone in chat please give 3 cheers for Vikrant, also known as NASA42, right now? Thanks to Vikrant's efforts and the efforts of all editors over the years, this year we published issue 400 of This Week in Rust. This felt great, knowing the newsletter has had such a long life. It inspired me to think about the larger context for it in our community. And as I went through the back issues and asked for thoughts from others, 5 key insights stood out to me about the Rust community. Insight number 1, Rustaceans are deeply dedicated to learning and teaching. And this is most apparent in the tutorials and blog post feature in This Week in Rust. To quote Quindot on Discourse, in the beginning, the articles and blog posts were the most important for seeing new patterns and examples and just learning about Rust generally. When I first started with Rust a few years ago, this section was the most important to me as well. Initially, a lot of the articles were over my head, but the ones which explain key concepts of Rust, things like ownership, borrowing, and lifetimes, were enormously helpful. They gave me the foundation to understand the more advanced Rust topics and practices. Unlike other online communities, I've never been called a noob when I've asked a question about Rust. We Rustaceans don't force people to go through pain in order to prove themselves worthy of being in our community. If you are interested in Rust, you are a Rustacean, you belong here, and we will be with you every step of the way. The absolute best thing about editing This Week in Rust has been to see how dedicated our community is to teaching. We were all new to Rust at some point and are committed to paving the way for those who come after us. Even though I now have a decent experience with Rust, the blog posts and tutorials are still very important to me every single week. Even if a post is explaining a concept I already know, seeing it explained in a different way deepens my knowledge and shows me other ways I can explain that concept to someone else. You don't fully know something until you can teach it. Writing up a tutorial or a blog post about a Rust concept, it doesn't only help your readers, it helps you become a better Rust developer as well. If you ever find yourself wanting to write something up but hesitate because you think, well, doesn't everyone already know this? Please write it up anyway. I guarantee there is someone out there who needs to hear your way of explaining to understand the topic better for themselves. As I learned more about developing Rust, I became more interested in how the Rust language itself is developed. And that leads me to insight number 2, and this was a bit of a surprise. Rust is developed in the open by regular people. If you look at the updates from Rust core section of This Week in Rust, you will see that an astonishing number of pull requests are merged each week. These aren't just major features, they are also small contributions like refactoring that make the compiler better for everyone. As M. Brubeck on the Discourse forums shares, I also love that This Week in Rust is a place that gives public recognition to contributions that might otherwise go unnoticed. In the Rust ecosystem, every contribution is important and vital to the success of all of us. As I delved more into the core update section and read through the changes, I got a better sense of not only how the language is constructed, but also a sense of the key people who make it. As Quindot on the Discourse forums put it, but perhaps more importantly, I became familiar with many key Rust developers and their roles and started following their blogs and so on. I personally experienced the exact same thing. When I started hacking on the compiler myself, I found Nico and Boat's blog posts about Rust async functionality, and it really helped me. Because I knew where to find them online, and because they had written down their thoughts, I was able to harness and build upon their recorded experience. This reinforced that I wanted to be more involved with not just using the Rust language, but also creating it. And this leads to insight number 3. Everyone is welcome and encouraged to become involved with the Rust ecosystem. When I was learning Rust, I found I learned about 20% of what I needed to know through things like books and tutorials. This was necessary stuff to learn, and the books and tutorials were fantastic. They gave me a great foundation to build on. But in order to unlock the other 80%, I needed to learn through doing, through writing Rust in real-world projects. One of the best places to find projects to get involved in is through the CFP, or Call for Participation section of This Week in Rust. This section features issues where, more often than not, a mentor is available to help. Moreover, because you know the projects are actively looking for new contributors, you know you will have support as you learn by doing. Another great place to find Rust projects to contribute to is through the Project Update section. Project updates serve 2 purposes. 1, introducing cool projects that people might want to use, and 2, also introducing projects that people may wish to contribute to. It's a great way to get started with writing Rust for real-world projects. As I became more experienced with using Rust, I started becoming more interested in how Rust itself is built. The best way I found to begin to understand this was through reading the RFC, or Request for Comment, and FCP, or Final Comment Period sections of This Week in Rust. These RFCs did seem over my head at first, but what was helpful was focusing more on the comments on the RFCs rather than just the RFC text itself. One of the reasons we have the RFC process is because Rust is used in so many different contexts. It's impossible for any 1 or 2 people, or even a few more people, to have all that context in their minds. In order to understand how a change will affect users, we need the context and experience of the entire community. Now, I'll admit, I was initially hesitant to write comments on RFCs myself because I was afraid that people would tell me I was wrong. But, as Aaron Turon put it in a blog post, no one can be wrong about their own lived experience. Rust needs your experience and your comments on RFCs and FCPs to make Rust the best language that it can be. And Nethercoat summed this up nicely on Reddit. This Week in Rust doesn't just distribute information, it potentially draws people into contribution. And once people are contributing, one of the best ways to encourage them to stay is through highlighting their work. And this leads me to the 4th insight. The Rust community acknowledges and celebrates all contributions. We do this in part by featuring Crates of the Week. This section was introduced in issue 95. Like the project updates, this section highlights crates that could be useful to Rust users. As Hojat12000 put it on Reddit, I check it out every week to see what new crates are there and which one could be useful for me. And along with the Crate of the Week itself, This Week in Rust also highlights the creator of the crate. Kanga Liu shared this on Reddit. I also had one of my crates featured on This Week in Rust, Display Utils, by submitting it myself. It was cool to see the crate get more traffic, although with 20 plus stars, it's now a bit inflated on my GitHub profile. For the record, Kanga Liu, I don't think there is anything inflated about the star rating on that repo. It shows that people found the Display Utils crate interesting and useful to them. It deserves those stars. Go ahead and put a +1 in the conference chat if you agree. Along with Crate of the Week, This Week in Rust also features a Quote of the Week. This is one of my favorite sections. There were a few early attempts to start this feature, but it really took off with the posting of this discourse thread asking for nominations. This thread is still used today, 6 years later, to nominate Quotes of the Week. And along with featuring the quote itself, we also shout out the person who nominated the quote. S. Sokolo on Reddit shared this experience. It was quite satisfying to see my name in the thanks for suggesting line on several quotes of the week. If you see someone say something clever, brilliant, insightful, or just funny in the Rust community, please consider nominating it for the Quote of the Week. Quotes of the week are how we laugh together, sometimes cry together, and know that we are not alone. And this brings me to the fifth and final insight. No Rustacean is alone. No matter what our level, no matter what our background, we are not alone in our interest in Rust. As Code 1985 put it on Reddit, that is always fuel to me to remember that I'm not alone who uses Rust. Even if you feel like you're the only Rustacean on your team, or in your company, or in your hometown, there is an entire community out there who both shares and cares about your interest in Rust. In the past year and a half, this has become even more important. DenB92 posted on Reddit, "When it comes out, I know a week has passed in quarantine." Quarantine has been hard on all of us. Among other things, it stopped in-person meetings of most Rust meetups. However, most of the meetups did not shut down completely. They moved online. Suddenly, you can go around the world and back every week through virtual meetups. I particularly enjoyed attending meetups in Washington, D.C., Dublin, Ireland, Eastern Europe, and more from my hometown in Seattle, Washington. Even in forced isolation, over the past year, I have felt more connected to the global Rustacean community than ever before. When communities are online, we don't ever have to feel alone, no matter where we are. I remember experiencing this in the early days of the internet when I thought I was the only Star Wars fan in my small Midwestern town. I connected to Star Wars bulletin boards on the internet and suddenly was reading messages from so many people who shared the same interest and passion as me. Online community became even more meaningful to me later on when, as a gay teenager at a small Catholic high school, I was able to find others online going through the same realization that I was. This may have very well saved my life, knowing that I wasn't alone in this world. Remember, the Rustacean community is as mature as it is, as empathetic as it is, through the efforts of every one of you. You make this community the way it is. As I move toward concluding this talk, I hope you take this with you. This Week in Rust is a community project. It's created for and by the outstanding Rustacean community. This means This Week in Rust is your project. No matter how long you've been interested in Rust, no matter what your level, no matter who you are, your contributions are welcomed and valued. It's your newsletter. It's our newsletter. And its success is because of every one of us. To subscribe to it, head on over to thisweekinrust.org. To contribute, either open a pull request on our GitHub repo at github.com/rustlang/thisweekinrust, or tweet at us at thisweekinrust on Twitter. And just before I close, I do want to make sure to call out all the previous editors of This Week in Rust, including Ember Arlinks, Brian Anderson, Vikrant Chaudhary, and Flavio Ditz. Please, everyone, put 3 cheers in chat for all of them. Thank you.